to another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show, and we have a lot to talk about. I am very excited for my guest on today's show because I really do feel like in the early episodes of this program, we've neglected the growing conflict, the coming conflict between the U.S. and China, particularly over Taiwan, and there's really nobody better to talk to about that today. Guest Joseph Solis-Mullen. Joe is the author of The Fake China Threat and Its Very Real Danger. He is a political scientist, economist, and the Ralph Raico Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. He is a graduate of Spring Arbor University, the University of Illinois, and the University of Missouri. And of course, he publishes a lot of great articles at the Libertarian Institute, where he's one of my fantastic coworkers. Joe, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Kyle. Thank you so much for having me. And for listeners who might be interested, because we kind of are in a small world in sort of the pro-peace libertarian circles, Kyle was actually, before we were Institute colleagues, I was trying to find an outlet that would publish a long-form criticism of the China threat narrative, and I couldn't find anyone willing to do it. And Kyle, who is editing at the Libertarian Institute, was the first one to take that on. And you can go look. It's like a 6,000 word New York Review of Book length article that Kyle was good enough to run at the Libertarian Institute. This was back in, I think, 2021. And that eventually grew into the book. So Kyle was actually instrumental in laying the foundation for the fake China threat. So credit where credit's due.
Well,
thank you, Kyle.
Well, thank you. I actually either didn't remember or wasn't aware that I had helped you out so much with that. But everything you've written on the China issue has been fantastic. And I have some things I really want to talk to you about in today's show. Kind of breaking down Hegseth recent remarks on Taiwan. And then, is China even a real threat? Is Ukraine a vital interest to Taiwan? And then Trump's BBB, which you wrote a pretty interesting article on for us at the Institute. So we'll start off on today's show just playing this clip of our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
We cannot look away, and we cannot ignore it. China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call. Any attempt by communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. It has to be clear to all that Beijing is credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. We know, it's public, that Xi has ordered his military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. Ultimately, a strong, resolute, and capable network of allies and partners is our key strategic advantage. China envies what we have together, and it sees what we can collectively bring to bear on defense. But it's up to all of us to ensure that we live up to that potential by investing.
So, Joe, my question here is, this sounds to me like the Trump administration doubling down on the Biden administration's policy, where Joe Biden took us in his senile, delusional state. He officially was the president who abandoned strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity, that we would defend and go to war with China over Taiwan. And Pete Hegseth, to my reading of this, is he's doubling down on that policy effectively.
Well, I think you raised several interesting points, and there are, I think, several telling things about Hegseth's speech. So the first thing that I would say is this. Right as the Trump administration was leaving for the first time, the Wall Street Journal reported that the United States, and this kind of flew under the radar at the time, but that the United States had troops on Taiwan, military trainers on Taiwan. That was at the end of the Trump administration. Throughout the Biden administration, as you said, Joe Biden several times said explicitly the U.S. would fight for Taiwan. Then, of course, later on, the press secretary would have to walk that back. The administration would walk that back. But he said it enough times that it seems clear. And as you said, now the Trump administration seems to be shifting away from ambiguity towards strategic clarity. It's worth noting, if you read policy circle papers and whatnot, that strategic ambiguity was always had its opponents. There have always been those within defense circles who argued that strategic clarity was a better policy. And so the Trump administration just seems more aligned with that. And certainly, there's been no real change in the policy. Everything keeps kind of moving in the same direction. You look at what's going on in the Philippines, the U.S. buildup in the Philippines that has now been going on for about 9 years. And it hasn't mattered. About 9 years. It hasn't really mattered who's been president. The Pentagon has been shifting resources, defense agreements, troop deployments. All of these different things just keep happening no matter who is president. So to some degree, I think those things are kind of running on autopilot. Certainly the Trump administration is much more hawkish on China, I think, than was the Biden administration. But in the same way, the Trump administration came in saying, hey, we're going to really change Joe Biden's Ukraine policy. But as you've talked about plenty and Dave's talked about plenty, there really hasn't been much of a change. So with regard to Hegseth's speech, which I thought was pretty inflammatory and full of some pretty dubious things, like, for example, the claim that we know that Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. We know that it's public. That's not true. You can't find that anywhere. That comes from an assessment made by U.S. intelligence officials that was put out that said, and I think it was, who was it that said it? I can't remember who told Congress that, but they basically said, no, we know from our assessment that China's planning to do this. Xi Jinping's never said that. The PLA's never said that. The PLA Navy's never said that. So, I thought there were a lot of very interesting back and forth at the Shangri-La Cooperation Agreement, other than Hegseth's pretty wild speech. For example, some of the back and forth between the different defense ministers, specifically the Philippines defense minister, which if you kind of pull up your map of East Asia in your head and you kind of look at where is Taiwan, where is China, you've got Japan over here and you've got the Philippines right here. And this kind of forms a nice, neat net there. And you look at where U.S. military assets are being positioned in the region. It's really very telling that these are important states in the effort to contain China. And of course, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is the son of one of America's former Cold War favorite sock puppet dictators. So there are very close connections there. And the U.S. has been really building up forces in that region. They've also been changing the configuration of those forces. For example, the Marines have been scaling down the number of artillery that they use in favor of more mobile land-based missile launchers. And they're building up near the islands that are closest to Taiwan. So it's very obvious who is trying to encircle who is a threat to whom. And when we talk about what China is a threat to, the Washington Post accidentally last week put it exactly right. And I threw it up on Twitter with the highlighted line. U.S. officials view China as a threat to Washington's power. Not the American people, not our well-being, not our health, our safety, our economic well-being, to Washington's power. And that's exactly right. Now, Bob Woodward had quoted one of Trump's defense secretaries saying the same thing. I think it was, I think it was Fury, maybe. It was one of those books where he said, look, Mr. President, you don't understand. China threatens American Indo-Pacific dominance right up to the shores of China. That's what the threat is. So I don't know. I know I went on for a while there, but
analysis, and it's really kind of how I like to describe it. Washington wants to treat the Pacific Ocean like an American lake, and that's really what China is interfering on. Now, when we talk about strategic clarity, I think the real risk here is of course, not just that the U.S. says to China we would go to war over Taiwan, but the reason that there was a preference for strategic ambiguity for many years was that this had a balance of two things. One, we weren't saying that we wouldn't go to war over Taiwan, and so this checked China from aggressing. At the same time, by not saying to the Taiwanese that we would go to war over Taiwan, we're not giving them the thumbs up on going in for an attack, going in for a fight. And so I'm just wondering, I guess, it kind of seems like two pieces here that would provoke the Chinese. One is the US in their military threats, but two, and another key component of this would be the Taiwanese moving down the road towards official independence. And so, how concerned are you about that?
Well, I'm not terribly concerned with Taiwan declaring independence, because something like that would be very provocative. It would almost certainly initiate a military response, and they have no need to do it. The previous president and the current president have both said, "Look, we are independent. It's we are de facto independent. We're our own state. We don't need to declare independence. We are independent." And so to me, I mean, it feels like that's the line they've walked up to. Beijing obviously disagrees with that. Uh, and there's really no pressure on the United States to do something like recognize it as an independent state. And the DPP leaders, the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan, they've all said, "Look, we are our own thing. We don't need to declare independence. We are already independent." And the KMT, the opposition party, over the past 15, 20 years, they've sort of moved away from the reunification idea. And so they're kind of more centrist now. There just doesn't seem to be any real. I think the danger of that was really more maybe in the 90s, early 2000s. Now I think Beijing has enough military capacity that if a showdown happened, that Taiwan couldn't be sure of the outcome, and that provoking by declaring independence, making some kind of constitutional change, for example, or asking for recognition as an independent state by Washington or something really provocative like that, could wind up having huge costs that it just wouldn't have had 25, 30 years ago. And so I think the real danger there would be pressure on by American hawks here, people like Mike Pompeo, who have said, we need to recognize Taiwan or something like that. So because I mean, there's plenty of think tanks who write papers saying that Team Blue gets crushed by Team Red 99 times out of 100 when we fight this scenario, and it's because of how China has invested in its military capabilities, while the United States is shifting its military capacity and posture and orientation in the Indo-Pacific. The fact remains that Taiwan is 80 miles off the coast of China, and it's several thousand miles from the United States. And so there are just certain facts of life. Carriers are going to be at a long distance away because of the amount of missile defense that China has along that southern coast there. It's an area denial strategy to be able to keep the United States at arm's length. And that's why having these positions in the Philippines is so important. And it's why the United States has worked very hard to do that. So, and to keep them mobile as well, to be able to move them around. So,
Well, and I guess I would imagine too that the campaign against the Houthis had to be a major red flag. That waging an offshore naval battle is not quite as easy as it sounds. Now, I want to move on and ask you about one of your recent articles for the Institute. And by the way, we have over 500 people listening live, so if you can, head on over, share the show. If you want to leave us a comment, the best place to do that is on YouTube. I will drop the link in the replies to the Eds live stream. I know a lot of people are watching live there. And so you wrote this recent article, Manufacturing a Menace. And I feel like it's a little bit the same theme as your book, which has a brilliant title. The China threat is fake, right? Joe, we don't have to worry about China coming to the US. We're not going to wake up one day with a Red Dawn situation or anything. China doesn't threaten the homeland. China doesn't even threaten Hawaii, which is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. However, every single day, this was literally the actual statements from the officials in the Biden administration, that they wake up every day on how we confront Taiwan or China. Everything they do is about China. And so if you're China and you're constantly hearing about this country preparing for a war with you, ramping up for a war with you, then I think it probably creates a reaction in China where they start to ramp up their nuclear program. They're producing more warheads, where they develop more capabilities to go to war with the United States. And maybe, just maybe, the rhetoric goes so far that we actually end up getting ourselves into a conflict here. And so what are your thoughts on this, Joe, and kind of where are we in manufacturing this Chinese menace?
Yes, that was, and the troubling thing is, so I write a lot of responses to things that appear in Foreign Affairs, because Foreign Affairs is basically a talking shop for a lot of the sort of the sort of centrist hawks, and a lot of times it's policy people. So that was an article that I was writing in response to Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi, both of whom were in the Biden administration, and actually Campbell was one of the authors way back during the Obama administration of the pivot to Asia. So when these guys are writing articles, it's worth paying attention to what they're saying, because these are the establishment voices. These are the policymakers. So a couple of things. Yes, absolutely. If you are sitting in Beijing and you are constantly hearing about how Washington is gearing up to fight you and to curtail you and to keep you down, look, I mean, I always ask people, like, look, just try to put yourself in the other side's shoes. Show some strategic empathy. Just try to think, how would you respond? Wouldn't it be rational for you to start taking countermeasures? What is the cost of not taking these countermeasures? Maybe there are other things you'd like to do. Maybe you don't want to do this, but wouldn't it be kind of neglectful of you not to start preparing for a possible eventuality of this kind? Um, the second thing, yes, look, in terms of accidentally provoking something, this was something that in the lead up to the Ukraine war, which I was writing I was at the Mises Institute at the time. I joined the Libertarian Institute, I believe, that spring. Yeah, shortly after, in 2022. What I was writing about the Mises Institute was like, guys, they're saying they're calibrating the amount of weapons that aren't going to provoke a Russian invasion. Like, there is no scale. There's no science to this. They're just telling us, don't worry, we're just pouring a bunch of weapons in there, and we know that what we're doing won't provoke anything. They're doing the same thing now. Beijing is saying, hey, stop doing this, too many weapons, too many offensive capabilities, stop doing this, these are red lines for us. And Washington just keeps going further and further and further. And one day, something terrible might happen. And I hope it doesn't. But you have this idea that deterrence, we're showing how strong we are, so we're going to deter them. Well, where is the line? When does deterrence, attempted deterrence, become provocation?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear where that line is. There is no hard scientific way. You can't measure it. You're just guessing. You're making a calculation about what the other side is willing to tolerate. Yeah. And we've seen the same thing in Ukraine, of course. So no, I mean, it's extremely dangerous. And of course, what the China threat, which I took the title, The Fake China Threat, from the initial China Threat book. There was a book written way back, it was 1999, I think it was, but it was called The China Threat. And the author has predicted that China is going to take over the world or collapse alternately, like every 5 years. But so I was making fun of him. And so, yeah. Well, but the thing is like Scott wrote in
Scott
Enough Already. Yeah, like Scott said, look, maintaining the empire, maintaining this quote unquote forward posture, it means taking away liberty at home. It means running massive deficits and financing it through inflation. It means upping the domestic surveillance state to make sure that blowback doesn't find its way to our shores because of what Washington's been doing there. So there are real costs. And I was looking at something the other day where they were talking about, Ukraine and doing this stuff and how it's probably going to cost this much money. And so it's like, guys, why are we paying for that? Like, that's the expectation.
I do want to circle back to the Ukraine issue and deterrence in a second, but I had this article from Politico I found today that said the headline is President Trump is obsessed. Trump fixates on Xi call amid faltering trade talks. And the report from a source said the president is obsessed with having a call with Xi. And so, Joe, my question is I guess in one sense, the Indo-Pacific hasn't been on the top of Trump's agenda because of everything going on in Ukraine and the Middle East. And as much as Washington says they could fight all those wars at the same time, it doesn't seem like there's the intellectual capacity in Washington to do so. And so China has been kind of put on the back burner in a sense, but there's also this trade war going on. And so what do you make of Trump's China policy in the first, 120 days or whatever we're at now, as far as how provocative has his China policy been, particularly as compared to Biden and maybe his first administration?
So militarily, we haven't really seen much of a change. Like I said, the Pentagon kind of runs on autopilot. Things continue to move in a negative direction. but they haven't like substantially, changed course or been dramatically worse. Where it is dramatically worse is in terms of trade. And the reason Trump might be very angsty about this is because really the rare earth minerals industry. Now, this is something that's absolutely critical. Is the United States wants, I shouldn't say the United States, Washington and the Trump administration specifically want a better trade deal with China. And so they've attempted to use tariffs to do this. The Xi government has retaliated by initially choking off the supply of rare this is key, processed rare earth minerals. Now, these things are used in very small quantities, and they're used in everything from cars to phones to computers, all that stuff, especially any kind of like really sophisticated tech. It needs these rare earth minerals. The problem is they're used in very, very small amounts. And so the thing is, it's not that you can't find these rare earth minerals other places. It's that over 90% of them are processed in China. And so Xi Jinping's administration created a whole new bureaucracy. So they basically have this new agreement, the Geneva Agreement. They're going to resume trade. They're going to start coming because right after the Liberation Day tariffs announcement, very quickly thereafter, all the major automakers wrote to President Trump saying, "Look, if we don't get these rare earth minerals, these processed rare earth minerals turned back on, we're going to have to start making production cuts. That's going to mean massive layoffs. You've got to restart the flow of these rare earth minerals." And so Trump said, "Hey, we'll do that. We're going to put the pause on the China tariffs. China, can you, send the minerals?" She says, "Sure." But in the meantime, they had instituted a new bureaucracy and licensing agreement, and it has been very slow. It has been very slow. The rare earths coming out of China are at a trickle. And this is something that might be making Trump a little angsty, honestly, is because the US doesn't really have a lot of leverage that they can use to speed this up. The one place that they do is semiconductors, and they've tried to do that. And China recently lodged a complaint about it, saying that, the attacks on the semiconductor export controls and on Chinese students were hostile and opposed to the spirit of the agreement that they had, that the truce that they had come to. So Trump is probably feeling very angsty about that. Those are very, very critical to the U.S. economy, and certainly some very politically important segments like the defense industry and the auto industry. And there's really nothing that he can do. He's in a very, very weak negotiating position about that, which is not a place that someone like Trump wants to be. No one wants to be in that position, obviously, but so that might be why he's fixating on that.
So my next question is, on this general subject of linking Ukraine and Taiwan. Now, there's kind of two ways that this is done. One is the Chinese support for Russia, and then the second, of course, is saying that deterrence is important. If we show that Russia could have Ukraine, then China could have Taiwan. That's how Beijing's going to take it. And so I wrote this recent article for the Libertarian Institute about a bill that's headed through Congress. And this bill has the 82 co-sponsors in the Senate with vast bipartisan support, a veto-proof bipartisan support just among the co-sponsors. The bill is senators push Trump to endorse major sanctions bill. And I note that the bill would also spike tensions with China and India, as the two Asian giants would be slapped with 500% tariffs for importing Russian oil. The senators hope that the threat of tariffs would lead Delhi and Beijing to end imports from Moscow and bankrupt the Russian war machine. And Lindsey Graham actually called this the most draconian bill that he has ever seen in the Senate. And he is the sponsor. He's the man pushing this bill. That's how he's trying to get it over the finish line. And so if what you just explained is true, would this bill not blow up the American economy, even if it does do some damage to the Russian one?
Yes, and it was actually this bill that I was referring to earlier, because these are costs that the American people are going to pay. 500% tariffs, that's going to rebound on us. And yes, 82, it's up to 82. It was 80 yesterday. I mean, 82 co-sponsors. That's crazy. You never see a bill with that many co-sponsors. The linkage idea. Yes, that's something that has been attempted. Emmanuel Macron, in his speech at the Shangri-La Cooperation Summit, he had said, look, we want to go away from that idea. We want a third way for smaller states who don't want to have to choose between these two. But at the same time, I mean, France is not in a position to call any amount of the shots here. So really, the whole idea that if, it just doesn't even make sense. Everyone is Hitler, appeasement, the lessons of the 30s. I just don't buy that. There were many, many ways to have avoided the war in Ukraine, just as there are many ways to avoid a war between China and the United States over Taiwan. It is a question of whether or not policymakers want to make them. I see no reason to think that Xi's calculations will change. Taiwan is going to be reunified with the mainland in his thinking. It is only a matter of time before that happens. In Chinese security circles, there is a real narrative of American declinism. The idea that the American empire has become soft, decrepit, that it's crumbling, that it's failing, and that it's only a matter of time before Washington won't even be around anymore to cause these problems. You have to think the Chinese state is, depending on who you ask, like they're many centuries, millennia old. They just have a different view of time than Americans do. This last century has been kind of a blip, right? China has always been on top, and then just in the last 100 years or so had a little unfortunate dip in the fortunes, but China's going to be back on top soon, and there's no reason we won't control our own little area as the thinking goes. And so there's no real urgency on their part to go and take it. It's going to be whether or not something that the United States or I don't think the Taiwanese would do this, but it's going to be someone else who prompts an action like that, where Xi feels like he has to respond, like Putin said on his phone call with Trump. After that Ukrainian drone attack on our strategic fleet, I have to respond. I have to do something. There's just going to be too much internal pressure on me not to do something. We tend to not appreciate, I think, as Americans living in a democratic society, we don't tend to think about the pressure groups on someone who's not elected. But Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, even though they're in authoritarian systems, like they do have internal constituencies within the government in defense circles who are going to be pressuring them to do different things. And there will be an expectation, if their legitimacy is to be maintained, that they do something in the face of a specific provocation. So,
well, and I had to say, I'm somewhat concerned that there may be a self-fulfilling prophecy here, where if the American empire effectively bankrupts itself in Eastern Ukraine and the Middle East, that China may see a unique historic opportunity. Look, the U.S. has stretched itself completely thin on the Patriot interceptor systems. We've actually taken some from Japan, repurposed them for American defenses so we could send extra ones to Ukraine. We've taken the retire systems from Israel and sent them to Ukraine. We've delayed the ones that we're supposed to be sending to Taiwan. We've spent so many interceptors for our ships and things like that, attacking the Houthis. We have like 30% of our THAAD, our most upgraded batteries, are actually deployed to Israel right now. And so I'm sure there are Chinese generals and hawks within Chinese circles saying, look, we have a unique opportunity here to do something about Taiwan when the Americans are tied up elsewhere. And as much as I think you're right that the Chinese aren't as eager to go to war as, say, the Americans are here, there probably is some recognition of that in Beijing right now. So any thoughts on that before we move on to talk about Trump's big, beautiful bill?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable reading of the situation. There are a lot of internal challenges that Xi's regime is trying to deal with right now, just in terms of the economy. And so I don't know that they would want to risk a foreign adventure because they're in such a strong position. And obviously, the name of the book is The Fake China Threat. And it grew out of the article, The Fake China Threat, which grew out of an article called China Won't Be Taking Over the World. And where I argued that, like, look, China may eventually become become predominant in its region. I don't know that it will ever become a regional hegemon, which Pete Hegseth said was its ambition. Which, look, these are states. States are power projection apparatuses. Every state wants to maximize its power projection capabilities. Every state would become a regional hegemon if it could. The question is, can China? And I had argued, no, it can't. Even if the United States does nothing, it can't. For all the million reasons I detail in the books and the countless articles, I've written hundreds of pages of articles about China and why this will not happen and why, everyone just needs to chill. So it's true that this would be, the United States is stretched very thin, but will there come a point where there's not even, like you said, the American empire is bankrupting itself? Will there become a point where it's just where the United States has gone back across the shores, back across the oceans to its own shores? Because, of course, the fortunes of war are risky. This is a historically good opportunity in relative terms, but is risking a war with a rival great power. If you can avoid doing that, you might want to.
Well, I guess, probably she looks at what's going on in Russia every day and thinks, man, that even if they are winning the war, it is coming at a pretty high cost. Now, the last thing I have up today, and I don't talk a ton about economics on this show, but there's a ton of talk right now about the big, beautiful bill. It's what everybody is discussing. Elon Musk is turning on Donald Trump. And by the way, I would like to have 1,000 people watching on live on X when Joe gives his analysis here. So if we could get just a few more people to share out the show, we will definitely hit that number. So your article from the Libertarian Institute on this is a libertarian critique of a big, beautiful bill. I hear two sides to this, Joe. One is that this is something that's going to cut the government, and you just got to give it time to work, and it's going to work beautifully. And we're going to see the national debt shrink over time. The other side is saying this actually increases spending, and all the future claims of cuts are just, future claims of cuts that we've heard time and time again throughout our lives, and they never actually materialize. So what's your take?
Okay, so first we need to be careful with our language. So, language number one, size of government. Sure, it will probably shrink the size of government, but it will not shrink the scope of government. A lot of this stuff is just going to be automated, AI type stuff. The government is going to become much better at spying on you and doing these things. Humans are doing a lot of these things. There is a push to automate a lot of this stuff. So yes, it could shrink the size, employment-wise. It is not going to shrink the scope of government. Government power is probably only going to expand, and it's not going to shrink the cost of government either. That's critical. Bottom line, this bill adds $2 trillion minimum over the next decade. The Congressional Budget Office said $2.4 trillion. I'm leaving a little bit of leeway there just in case a handful of the Department of Government Efficiency cuts get codified. I don't think they will. Trump, after Elon Musk threw a fit about it, asked, hey, can you guys please include like $9 billion worth of cuts? So I'm being a little generous there. But no, there's no reason to think that that's going to happen. These expenditures are only going to continue because, look, nibbling around the edges, USAID, look, great, love it, got it. That didn't even wind up happening. But even if it had, that's not the problem. The problem is bigger. It's structural. It's entitlements and defense spending, and now it's interest on the debt. Interest on the debt is now $1 trillion a year. It's actually more than that. It's increasing every day, but it's over $1 trillion now. You've got a military budget that in real terms is over $1 trillion. And then you've got entitlement spending that's, well over $1 trillion. You can't cut Social Security or Medicare. Those are third rails of American politics. Can't cut defense spending. And then you've got the interest on the debt. There's nothing else to do. Literally, like already before Trump's bill, which is going to increase the deficit, the Congressional Budget Office during the Biden administration was saying, well, we project that until 2032, we're going to have $2 trillion annual deficits. That means adding $2 trillion to the debt every single year. So this Trump bill will add approximately like 600 billion, 700 billion to the debt each year over the next decade. So, I mean, it's not going in the right direction. And even worse, when you talk about things like the automation and sending AI to do a lot of these things, I mean, the spying and data collection and stuff, it's going to get even worse, actually. which is unsurprising when you look at who's in Trump's circle there. So in terms of like the sort of tech-based neocon types, who are connected with like Peter Thiel and his companies. So no, the big beautiful bill is terrible. I don't blame Elon Musk for feeling shafted, but I also wrote back in November, and then I wrote in January and in February. I wrote like 3 or 4 articles about, hey, the Doge idea is nothing new. Here are 3 other times that someone came to office swearing they were going to cut the government down, cut the government spending down, and they all failed. And here's why they all failed. And here's why Doge is going to fail. And then I chronicled it failing as it was failing. So no surprises there. And here you go. So.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Your analysis is absolutely brilliant. Again, I've neglected the China issue so far, just focus pretty much solely on talks with Iran, talks with Russia, the war in Ukraine, Israel's genocide in Gaza. But it could sneak up on us, and we could be at a place where there's a very intense conflict in the South China Sea with the Philippines, in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait. And so I'm very happy to have you here to break that down. I will certainly have you back on the show in the future, particularly if any tensions flare with China. So everybody, again, Joseph Solis-Mullen, he is at the Libertarian Institute, almost a weekly column there or so. So definitely check out his work. And of course, his book, The Fake China Threat and the Very Real Danger. Joe, thank you so much. And again, I'll have you back on the show in the future.
Thanks so much, Kyle. It was great talking to you.
All right, everybody, don't forget to share out the show, repost it. We do have 1,000 people listening live, so that's really awesome to see. And just thank you for your continued support. And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel.